Life can be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. How many of the major things in your life, your job, your location, your relationships, were determined by pure chance? Did they happen out of the blue, or did they come from intent and planning? It's natural for us to think that life progresses in a linear fashion, a continual and marginal and, most importantly, predictable movement to the right. But this is just us mapping out the future based off the finite experiences of our past. To broaden your horizons beyond that which you have directly experienced is an entirely unnatural thing to do. How can we predict a future of infinite possibilities based off a finite experience of the past? The future that lays at your feet right now can take any number of an infinite amount of divergent paths. Realizing the infinite possibility is everything. An unpredictable future is both exciting as well as daunting. However, it is an altogether inescapable fact. The future is unpredictable. There is too much beyond our control for predictability, too many variables we can't take into account. And so you can choose to either continue to ride down the river of randomness, being pulled back and forth according to the current, or you can instead invite serendipity into your life and introduce an infinite amount of divergent paths. The paths will still be entirely random and largely unpredictable, but they will at least increase the likelihood of bliss and also return agency to the direction that you're going to. Along the lines of Taleb's fooled by randomness metaphor, we all cross the street every day. And although some fools will occasionally make it to the other side, blindfolded to all the risk of the world, whilst others who meticulously pave their way will still be wiped out, noticing the serendipity, noticing the infinite potential of divergent paths, at least this returns you to the liberty of control and hopefully, if you're lucky, an exposure to serendipity that can change your life precisely the way you dreamt it would. My guest on this podcast is the author of The Serendipity Mindset, a German by the name of Christian Busch, and now bear with me because he has quite a resume. He's the director of the Global Economy Program at New York University Center for Global Affairs, visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and co-founder of Leaders on Purpose, an organization convening high-impact leaders, as well as the Sandbox Network, a global community of young innovators active in over 20 countries. Christian is among the Thinkers 50's top upcoming management thinkers, Diplomatic Courier's top 99 influencers, The Economist's Ideas People, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He frequently speaks at conferences such as the World Economic Forum, Financial Times, the Sustainability Summit, and his ideas have been featured by outlets such as Harvard Business Review, The Economist. He is on the Ashoka selection panel, which although was something very interesting to me and almost certainly for the wrong reasons, I failed to question him about. And he has been published seemingly everywhere and so on and so on. The hour between us flew by. I had prepared 3x the amount of material that we actually got through. So tweeted him, DM him, and bother him relentlessly, and maybe we'll be able to twist his arm into a second go around. In this podcast, you can expect to hear and learn about Friedrich Hayek on serendipity, also many famous examples throughout history of serendipitous inventions. Something I thought that was missing from the book, the opportunity cost of always optimizing for serendipity, an international look at how different cultures experience randomness, Nassim Taleb, of course. And then finally, I asked Christian for some young advice, and hopefully you will see in brackets, me myself forcing a type of serendipity. So, dear listener, I'm speaking directly with you now, and let's assume that we have more in common than we do not. We are met here today for serendipity. But we will rendezvous back again next week? I hope so. Let's assume we have more in common than we do not. Let's assume that while this might be something interesting to you, there is also going to be other things equally, or perhaps even more so, interesting to you. I want to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. Based off the email correspondence I've had so far, this podcast has attracted extremely brilliant, smart, but most importantly, curious people. And I feel really honored to be in such good company. So share this with a mate, pump your good juice into the algorithm, subscribe, and leave a review. Let the podcast directories start indexing a curious worldview. And of course, as usual, hang around to the end of the conversation for my thoughts on the chat, and then with no further delay, here is Christian Busch. Welcome, Mr. Busch. Christian, thank you so much for joining me, mate.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yep, my pleasure. I wanted to kick right into it. So in the opening of the book, you tell this anecdote of your friend, okay? And this is something that you've spoken about many times, I know, but never have I seen it answered from this angle. And at the last moment, your friend decides not to ride in the passenger seat of your car because he left his jacket in the other car. You went on to then crash this car moments later, which would have surely killed your friend or whoever sat in that passenger seat. So a huge moment. To me, this is not the outcome of this, your friend not getting into the car, you not having to live with the guilt of having accidentally killed your friend. This isn't a case of some sort of serendipity that can be cultivated, and rather it's just a case of pure chance. So to start, can you make that distinction for us, the distinction between total randomness and then serendipity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that example, in terms of the context, I used to be that completely reckless teenager who probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins you can knock over on your way to school. And then exactly that kind of came out of essentially a reckless driving maneuver where I was trying to take over the car of a friend. And, we essentially, to your point, in an alternative world, I would have almost killed my best friend at that point. And so I think that is one of those examples where it put me on an intense search for meaning. And I think, it's been more one of these kind of unexpected events that really shaped a lot in, my life and into who I am. I think, to your point, like most of that was very random, but also I had agency, right? Like it was me who was driving the car. It was me who, in a way, influenced a lot of that situation, in this case, to the worst. And so I'm actually, in the bigger picture of things, really interested in that question of when we think about serendipity, what is the agency we have in a moment, right? So if you imagine the kind of coffee shop situation where, you spill coffee over someone that kind of, if you have erratic hand movements like I do, you do that, right? And so let's say you spill coffee over someone and they look at you a little bit kind of, but you sense there might be something in that situation, right? And now you have two options. Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. And then you walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I acted on that unexpected moment? And then option number two, start a conversation. That person becomes the love of your life, your co-founder, you name it. The point is our reaction to the unexpected, our reaction to that accident, making the accident meaningful. That's what serendipity is about, right? That we essentially have our agency in it. And so that I'm sure we'll talk about this, but, when you map kind of serendipity over, different ideas and different lives, what's always happening is it's either we make accidents meaningful or we create more meaningful accidents. And I think both are super exciting to kind of train ourselves in.
Interesting. So you see the outcome of the crash, the serendipitous moment, and everything before it was just the blind random walk through life.
Well, it's interesting because it's almost, a lot of my work is with people across different areas who are doing interesting things. And one of the things they have in common is that they are, in a way, turning unexpected crises or moments that somehow could have meant the end into something that then actually led to whatever they are working on and their ultimate kind of success. And I've always been very curious about that question, right? How, in a way, a lot of times serendipity has an incubation time, right? It's kind of that thing where you might have a trigger, like some kind of event happening at some point, right? Like a breakup with someone or whatever it is. But then over time, you're kind of like making sense out of it. And you're like, oh my God, there's actually a much better fit over here. Now it becomes meaningful. So the meaningfulness of a situation a lot of times only unfolds over time. And I'm a big fan of that idea, right? That if we stop the story too early, that's it. But if you want a happy ending, don't stop the story too early.
So there's a great quote pretty early on into the book. You open up a lot of the chapters with some quote from history that has been repurposed to have a meaning for serendipity, right? And one that stood out to me was Friedrich Hayek earlier on. So he said something along the following lines: the preservation of humanity depends on maximizing the amount of opportunities for accidents to happen. And I heard that and I thought, I really like Hayek. I thought, fantastic, great quote, another brilliant insight into behavior. But isn't it a little bit of a nihilistic way to look at things? Because it takes sort of agency out of the individual's hands and just delegates our fate to randomness. He just wants, he thinks the preservation of humanity is determined by the randomness of accidents that could potentially happen to us. So how do you think about the problem of over-ascribing one's destiny or particular outcome to purely chance and serendipity?
I think it's a great question. I think one of the reasons why I think it is extremely important as an idea is that if you look at, right, up to 50% of inventions, innovations, when you look at your life, how you met the love of your life, you name it, a lot of times there was some kind of chance, randomness involved in that.
100%, yeah.
So there was some kind of agency, right? You had to work for it. Like, it wasn't enough to just bump into her and then, in a supermarket, like, you actually had to talk with her, right? And you had to somehow go on a follow-up date and so on, right?
Take a risk.
Exactly. And so I think that's, in a way, also the bigger point behind that, to say, hey, look, the unexpected happens all the time, if we see it or not, right? It's extremely likely that the unexpected will happen. Life is exponential in the sense that there's so many things out there that we can't know and that will happen. And so we might as well build a muscle for that. And so that's really what the thinking is about, to say, look, I will not always be able to tell you when exactly you will have it happen. I will not be able to tell you the outcome. But what I can tell you is that if you build a muscle for it, it is much more likely that you will have more of it. And so, to give an example, how do you, because I think the beautiful agency actually in that is that you can make that accident meaningful, right? In the example of Viagra, let's say you give someone medication and there's some kind of movement happening, right? They gave people medication against angina, some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And instead of saying, oh my God, this is so embarrassing, let's forget it, they did the opposite. They said, oh my God, a lot of men in the world have a problem, right? So let's make it a medication. So the point is, that's an example of how you make an accident meaningful, in the kind of sense of there is agency even in that randomness. But then on the other side, what I'm actually even more excited about is the question of, how do we create more of those meaningful accidents in ways that, by definition, we can't know what it is, but we can do it. To give an example, I'm a big fan of the hook strategy, where it's all about saying, there's this dreaded "what do you do" question, right? Which is putting people into boxes. And if you would ask that question to Ollie Barrett, an amazing entrepreneur in London, he would say something like, well, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently read into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so now, you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching on the philosophy of science. You should be a guest lecturer. Oh my God, such a coincidence, I'm hosting piano matinees. You should drop by. The point is, we can seed these different hooks that we are interested in into any kind of conversation, and let the other person see if there's something that randomly might be an overlap between us that we didn't even know about. Because by definition, we can't know what is out there. And so I think there's a lot of these kind of practices that we can use to make it more likely that some kind of randomness actually favors us, and we can be part of creating that actually, which is a lot of agency, I think, on our side.
What about the distance between purposely using your agency towards an end goal and simply just riding along with the flows of life, hoping that serendipity and chance are going to take you in the right direction? One of those is a nihilistic path, right? And obviously you're coming at it from a very cultivated worldview where you've thought about serendipity for quite a long time, and you can introduce something like the hook strategy, but that would not necessarily be someone's immediate go-to who's just listening to this. This quote from Hayek makes it seem almost that it is a random walkthrough of life, because he just wants to allow for accidents to happen rather than, as you say, look into what I have agency over and try and maximize the serendipity I can take from it. I'm trying to get at that gap there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, in a way, when you think about what, a nihilistic perspective would be about, there's just no meaning, right? You're just kind of essentially saying, look, I'm just kind of floating and floating.
I have no control over this. If it happens, it happens. That's great. If it doesn't, fuck it. I didn't have control anyway.
Yeah, so the Hakuna Matata approach to life, in a way, the Lion King approach. But I think, it's interesting because, to me, both actually have a lot of value, especially when you do them together, right? So in the sense of, what do I mean with this? We all go through different ebbs and flows in life, right? We have periods in life where we know where we're going, right? So we have periods where, great, I just found my passion, and I found that passion maybe randomly because I was at a concert and I realized that I love playing the guitar, and then I fell into it, right? So now that kind of getting me into that was completely random, but now I know I want to do that, and now I focus on that. I have a purpose, and now I can focus my serendipity more on that kind of bigger idea of, I want to become a guitar player in my life, and now I'm looking more for incidences that could relate to that broader purpose or sense of direction. But then on the other side, sometimes in life we might just be like, we just quit a job and we give ourselves half a year of travel and just say, let me just see what's out there. And I think those periods are extremely important because they don't assume that we have it all figured out. And quite the opposite. They say, you know what? A lot of times you have to rubber stamp towards who you could really be, because with all the potentiality out there, yes, we can assume that we can know what we actually want, but actually a lot of times that's just not the case. It's this illusion of control, right? That we can pre-plan, pre-know and everything else. And then we bump into that unexpected person. We're like, oh my God, I didn't even know I would like XYZ job or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of excitement actually, and that's exactly, I think you make a great point there. If we see that as disruptive, right, then essentially everything that's unexpected is a threat to us, right? Because everything then is like, it disrupts my life, it's against my plans. And I grew up in Germany, right? By definition, a lot of things are against like how I grew up, right? Like I love planning, I love mapping, but real life obviously.
The organized life.
Okay, exactly. And so I think the key thing here is to say, at the end of the day, there's a time for everything. And there's a time for having a sense of direction and then relating serendipity to it and getting things done. And then there's a time where we just have to allow for potentiality to happen. And I think his point was a lot around that idea. Look, if you think about how life-changing societal things happen, they don't come because there's a brilliant person thinking about it. It comes because Fleming works on something different and then randomly comes across something that becomes penicillin. Right?
Exactly.
That's how kind of society advances.
That's one of the great anecdotes of history of serendipity at work, isn't it? This guy accidentally leaves his, what do you call it? The tray. Yeah, just leaves it in a place it shouldn't have been. It was actually his negligence that left it there. That he comes back and all of a sudden he's discovered something that in its lifetime will save billions of lives. An actual a pivoting moment of history completely came out of randomness. And in his sense, obviously serendipity, the Viagra sense serendipity as well. A great part of your book, obviously, is littered with this sort of historical anecdotes and examples. And it gives people a lot of hope that they could themselves stumble upon one of these crazy inventions as well, depending on what field they're in. Obviously, science have a little bit of a scaling advantage since their serendipitous moments can affect a lot more than, say, a podcaster's. But I do want to push back a little bit on something that I thought was missing from the book. And correct me where I'm wrong if it was in fact not missing, but I just didn't see it. And it's the opportunity cost to constantly chasing and optimizing for serendipity. Because the question of what I'm doing with my life versus how am I setting it up for serendipity, which is the question you pose to the reader at the end of the book. And this is how I see it, to capitalize on serendipity requires optionality, requires freedom of movement, freedom of time, freedom to say no to something because this new thing that has serendipitously fallen on your lap has come to you. So it requires this optionality, and that's a real opportunity cost, which most people just don't have, right? So to truly capitalize on serendipity requires this optionality. It's a very risky trade-off. It requires you to say, not plant such firm roots, whether that's through relationships or whether that's through assets or whether that's through whatever. So can you reflect on the opportunity cost of constantly chasing serendipity, and in reality, how there actually is a smaller scope to the potential serendipitous opportunities you could grasp versus those that actually come into your life? Did the way I frame that question make sense?
Absolutely. And
okay.
It's a great one. And I probably would, I think about it from two perspectives. One is the perspective of constraints, right? We all have constraints in the sense of, to your point, time, opportunity. A lot of my work is in extreme resource constrained environments where people don't have, a lot of resources that could potentially, a lot of networks that you could bump into, right? Those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But especially in those contexts, actually, out of necessity, serendipity evolves a lot, right? And so the fascinating thing is that actually a lot of times, similar to creativity and innovation, out of necessity comes a lot of that. And so I think the interesting thing is that when you think about constraints in whatever environment, let's say, you settle somewhere in a village, and that's, it's very likely that you will have less serendipity there than if you would have settled in the middle of New York and put yourself into a co-working space.
Yeah,
right?
certainly.
By definition, like, you can place yourself a bit more for serendipity. Having said that, the idea of the serendipity mindset is to say, in any situation, like, we did a lot of research across like all different types of contexts, you can always do something. Like, imagine you live in that village and now you catch up with your uncle or you catch up with your father, and you can do your routine thing, right? Like the questions you always talk about and everything else. Or you can like randomly flag a little bit. Hey, like, by the way, I'm currently exploring a little bit XYZ thing. Just if you hear something, and then they'll be like, oh my God, coincidentally, the uncle of the brother of the sister like worked on something similar. You should connect. The point is that every interaction bears some kind of potentiality that a lot of times we completely shut down because we assume it's not there, right? I don't assume that when I talk with my uncle, there's any kind of exciting, meaningful serendipity that come from that. But actually, a lot of times, clients, for example, come from the most unexpected conversations with someone whom we know really well.
Totally.
And we can't know by definition that they knew a person who could know a person, right?
Yeah.
So to your point in terms of constraints, I think in any kind of situation, even if it's time pressure, if it's whatever it is, it's always that kind of, yes, I have a busy life, but then on the street towards the airport, my plane gets canceled. And then what do I do in that situation? There's always something, right, that still can be done. So I think that's the constraint question. In terms of the opportunity costs in general, I think it's a great question also in terms of opportunity cost itself, right? If I take an opportunity that is serendipitous, what do I not take, right? Or what could I have taken?
Exactly.
And I think it's a great point, right, around someone like me who I have a lot of serendipity in my life, and I have to protect myself a little bit from it because I love it. Right?
You've cultivated it, right? People come to you now, but like, take you as the example. Now you've got a child on the way. You're rooted in New York. All of a sudden, the opportunity cost for you to take advantage of these serendipitous opportunities is exponentially higher than it was before. And so it doesn't mean to ignore it, but still, like, how do you think about it? And it's worth adding that in to the ingredients of understanding serendipity.
Absolutely.
It's not all just like...
Exactly. And that really comes to the idea of filters, right? To say, what is my filter so that I don't get distracted from the journey I'm on, right? Like and that's why I'm such a big fan of like doing a serendipity journal or whatever it is, where we just write down what is kind of our current sense of direction, North Star, values, whatever it is, just something that allows us to understand where are we headed. Like I don't write it down, but I know what I want to like head towards at the moment is, raising a wonderful child and focusing on that family and kind of getting the serendipity mindset into as many curricula and organizations as I can in the world. Like, I know these are kind of, in a way, my current North Stars that I'm focused on. And so now when I have conversations, I try to see, could there be some kind of serendipity related to that? And if it's not, I try to use that kind of parking lot system of saying, hey, this sounds amazing. Let's put this into the calendar for like in half a year, and then let's reconnect, because that is, at the moment I can't, but that is something I love in general. So why don't we do that at another stage? And so I think I'm a big fan of everything that's about filtering through our sense of direction, but also parking lot type things or brain trusts, right? Informal brain trusts where you ask people for advice and say, do you think that fits me at the moment? And in companies, of course, also the same, right? Companies like Pixar, that's what they do, right? They have informal brain trusts where they have so many ideas coming in, but in order to not get distracted, they have a couple of people who say, okay, that makes sense at the moment, that doesn't. And so I think those kind of filters can help us a lot, probably, to reduce that risk that we definitely face. And I don't think there's a golden bullet to
No, unfortunately not. The way I thought about answering that question was like along similar lines. It's just recognizing that there is a genuine opportunity cost to everything that you're doing. And although the opportunities for serendipity might remain the same, your ability to act upon them will diminish over time the more rooted you get or the more things you take on. For example, imagine if you just had unlimited time. You would be able to participate in 1,000x the things that you're doing now, and potentially that 1% hit rate could end up being whatever it became. And that's totally within your possibility now, but it's not going to be realized because you've had to say no to it to make time for something else. And so I just think the question of opportunity cost generally, but especially in the conversation of serendipity, is an important caveat to notice as well. something that stood out to me a lot when I was reading about your bio was the amount of different cultures and countries you've worked with. So obviously you're German. You live in the United States. You spent a lot of time in England. You've also studied and worked in Mexico, Russia, China, Kenya. I mean, this is a nice cross-section of humanity. And I wanted to see whether different cultures embraced serendipity and chance differently from one another, or do we all kind of think about it the same way?
Yeah. No, it's intriguing, right? Because, I mean, as a German, in a way, presumably we're on one side of the extreme, right? The kind of planning, mapping everything out type.
Total agency, yeah.
And it's interesting because I feel in a way I've gone through different cycles depending on where I've lived, right? So in a way, when I grew up in Germany, I also try to plan things more, and I that's the way I grew up, right? To say, hey, look, like plan your career, plan everything you can plan. And then, I would spend a lot of time in countries like Kenya or India and where there's this amazing entrepreneurial energy and this kind of idea of, hey, look, like let's make the best out of a situation and let's not worry too much about like planning for the next 10 years, but like let's make the best out of what's happening here. And so I think what I've been becoming to enjoy is that obviously every culture has something that defines it a bit more than other things, right? So entrepreneurialism versus kind of, more kind of top-down planning type and those kind of things. But what I've seen is, across different cultures, the mindset itself is very similar. It's always somehow people who are able to spot and connect dots, right? It's essentially people who see something in the unexpected and turn into positive outcomes. And I think that's what I found extremely fascinating, that in a way we can take the best out of these different cultures. We can say, hey, how can we, as someone who was used to planning, understand that illusion of control? So how do we build in a little bit of the entrepreneurial mess, but at the same time, when we're in an entrepreneurial context, how do we bring in a little bit of the planning? And I think that's actually, we did a study with purpose-driven leaders, and one of the big findings was that the most successful people essentially are the ones who are able to have some kind of sense of direction and at the same time allow for the unexpected to emerge. And I think that's in terms of the leadership style that you can see across different cultures as well.
Yeah. Any particularly fun anecdotes from a different country thinking about risk? I mean, I'm just imagining from my own experience, right? I mean, a Chinaman will react differently to risk to a Mexican, right? They're almost wired a little bit differently about that. Do you have any personal experience noticing the difference?
Well, look, I mean, I think the book title was one of those, things where I remember because there's different publishers for different countries. And so when I went to the UK publisher, it would be something, they first wanted to push for something along the kind of the signs of luck or the signs of something. And then I would go to my American publisher and they would be like, let's just call it Get Lucky. And so it's kind of like, in a way, the kind of different types of approaches, how we look at it. But more importantly, I remember, for example, in the UK, and again, I'm always hesitant to put like a label on a culture. If you look at London,
of course,
example, right?
Yeah, it has to be given with the caveat that it's a pinch of salt.
Exactly. And like, in the cities where I lived, I don't think there are fair representations of the culture itself. In London, you probably have more people who are not British than people who are British. I
think you do, actually. That's like one of the gripes of the right in London.
Exactly. But so my point is that I think, I remember how, for example, in London, right, at the institution I was before, I had this amazing colleague, like a very kind of British, proper colleague who's fantastic. And, he would say, Christian, look, like I love everything you talk about, but I don't need serendipity in my life. And I would say, why not? And he was like, look, I have everything mapped out. I'm okay. I'm like, there's nothing I need.
Right.
And so we said, okay, like, let's make a deal. Like, start with small exercises, like ask one different type of question and see what happens. And he comes up, like, a couple of weeks later, he comes and says, oh my God, I didn't know life can be so joyful. And so my point is, I think what I found fascinating is, there's the cultural things, but also I think there's the kind of either people who quote unquote believe in serendipity or people who don't, right? And those people who don't, they are actually the ones where I initially thought, you know what, I want to focus on those who do. But then I realized, the real impact actually comes with those who didn't believe in it or who felt, this is not for me. And then they start doing it. They're like, oh my God, there's so much more to life that I hadn't even known about. And I think that is kind of where I get most of my excitement nowadays from, to say, how can I help kind of with that mindset shift? Because that's where I feel the real impact comes.
Yeah. I guess taking your very typical Englishman as an example, they're more cynical than your typical other cultural. Maybe cynicism actually would correlate quite well with a skepticism towards serendipity, right? Because like the sort of cynical worldview is that, you know, lucky things only happen to lucky people, or only people of this sort of privilege would get this sort of luck. It could never trickle down to me, or something like that. Maybe is that that's just something that that came to me as you were speaking. Do you think there's any truth to that? The correlation between cynicism and a fear of serendipity, a fear of chance?
Well, it's a great question, because I think, you know, when you think about the different ingredients that can help with serendipity, a lot of times optimism, or, you know, like looking at the world and presuming that things can happen, frames how we look at the world, right? So by definition, we will see more potentiality out there because we believe it can be there. And so then we see more opportunity in the unexpected. And I'll give you an example in a second. But then I think in general, you know, I have very close friends who are not at all optimistic, who are quite cynical, but they're extremely good at connecting dots, where you could tell them about anything and they would be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My friend does the same. Let me put you in touch and do something. And so in a way, you can have serendipity without optimism, but most likely you will have more serendipity if you have that optimism, but also, again, the perspective on life. And it's one of my favorite experiments, actually. And, you know, you probably came across it in the book. It's kind of that idea of lucky versus unlucky people and the experiment they did. And it's one of my favorites because it's so much about how do we frame the world in a way is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy of what actually happens. And so in this example, they took people who self-identify as very lucky, right? So people who say, good things tend to happen to me, yay. And people who self-identify as very unlucky, right? Bad things happen to me, I'm always in accidents and that kind of thing. And then they pick one of each and say, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, sit down, grab a coffee, and then we'll have our interview, our conversation. Now, what they don't tell them is that there's £5, a £5 note in front of the coffee shop. Inside the coffee shop, the one seat is next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big ideas happen. And, you know, so lucky person, you know, walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders a coffee, sits next to the businessman, has a conversation, they exchange business cards, potential opportunity coming out of it, we don't know. The unlucky person steps over the £5 note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, ignores the businessman, and that's that. At the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street. I made new friends and, you know, potentially an opportunity. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And, you know, the thing here is that this idea, you know, you, for example, right, let's say if you would take one other street to work in the morning and you actually look around and then you look into the bookstore and you see this title and you're like, oh my God, I've never done a podcast about this. Hey, Eureka, Serendipity, new podcast about XYZ new topic, right? The thing is that your alertness and you believing that the unexpected is out there and practicing in relation to that makes it more likely that it actually happens. The other part, of course, with the businessman, you know, there is some benefit to extroversion sometimes in the sense of, you know, if you talk to people, it's more likely that
certainly,
lots and vice versa. But as a closet introvert myself, you know, I'm a big fan actually of thinking about there's so many practices introverts can do. Because, you know, a lot of times serendipity comes out of silent sources, right? Movies, taking that other street to work, reading something and then connecting the dots. But also we can leverage extroverts, right? We can tell extroverts about our idea and then they go to the event and talk about it, things like that, where, you know, we can in a way also find ways that as introverts we can survive in this extrovert world.
It's so funny. Taleb has, Nassim Taleb, someone who I'll introduce later, he has a quote exactly about that because he suggests that one of the best ways to become more anti-fragile, defend from the black swan is to go to parties, a very reductionist approach to looking at things. But he says, if you're an introvert, send a proxy, which is exactly what you just said as well. Like if you are introverted, I mean, make sure someone goes to the parties on behalf of you at least. But I think you're totally right there. Or at least I agree that optimism is a pretty crucial variable in the cultivation of serendipity, or at the very least, seeing the potential of serendipity, even if it doesn't fall into your lap the way that you wish it did, you still can believe that it is out there. And just talking about cultivating serendipity, I think there is, at the moment at least, there's few better mediums than hosting a podcast for doing something like that. The type of spectrum of people that you can talk to. For example, the only reason I found your book is because it was recommended to me through audible.com after I listened to Leonard Moldanov's The Drunkard's Walk. And I only got recommended that because I was recommended because I consumed the inserto. And so it was kind of like, that in itself is a serendipitous outcome. And now I get to talk to you, and who knows where it goes. But speaking of the cultivation of serendipity, you wrote a book called Serendipity Mindset, right? So you have centered yourself at the gravitational pull of anybody who's thinking about serendipity. So obviously a lot of it comes to you. I wanted to ask what the most significant moment of serendipity you've received so far from the book.
It's interesting because I think, to your point, the beauty of it is that it's, an opportunity space, right? Where it's kind of saying, hey, look, this is the opportunity space, and then people can connect the dots and see how it relates to the moment or in that time of the book. I think the biggest one was certainly COVID. When COVID happened last year, the book literally the day before. So on the day when the review copies for the book arrived, the Penguin Random House had to close down their offices, so they didn't get access to the copies anymore. So we had to think about, okay, well, what can we do? And as a first time author, you're like, oh my god, I would have loved to be in airport stores and all these kind of physical bookstores, because that's how people can find you when you don't, when you're not a kind of Michelle Obama type person with like hundreds of millions of followers.
You don't have the big platform already, yeah.
Exactly. And so in a way, it closed down a big part of the platform, right? And so it was a lot about that. Actually, what happened though was that the book became much more international, because in a way now you can speak at a conference in Costa Rica in the morning, then you go to Japan in the afternoon, and then you're back in the US in the evening, and you literally fly like a private plane via Zoom, right? And so I think for that, a lot of the kind of internationalness of the book, I think, came from that ability in a way to do everything from the living room. But more importantly, during that same period, so I caught a severe form of COVID and almost died of it. And it was during that time when they had all these kind of, when New York was essentially completely shut down. And I remember, that was the kind of moment where I was like, look, I'm alone in a New York City apartment here. I could have died, and I've focused so much on my passions and so much on kind of like building and creating impactful things that I've neglected to actually think more about creating a family and actually being with someone where it feels meaningful also in those kind of situations to be. And so I kind of opened my perspective to saying, hey, look, I'm actually ready now for a meaningful relationship. And so a couple of weeks later, I serendipitously reconnected with an old friend of mine who now is my wife, and we're expecting a baby. And it's kind of that period that came out of it where she had just come out of a divorce and similarly tough crises. And that kind of moment of, both being in a really rough place, but also that kind of COVID unexpected event in a way, shaping a little bit, saying, oh, wow, we should look differently at life again. I think that to me was the biggest serendipity, that it didn't come out of the book directly, but it was kind of at the same time as the book developed.
Okay.
Actually, the paperback that comes out in January has that story as part of it. So it kind of becomes now part of the book itself again. So it's kind of a full circle type.
Well, you moved fast. Good work.
Oh, but if you would meet her, you would understand that you do want to make sure that
that's amazing. It makes me think of, just to keep it on the theme of serendipity, but the Soren Kierkegaard, life can be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards, and it's kind of like that path that led you to your wife now and having a child was not something that you could have ever predicted, obviously, because you would have never known that get this random virus out of China might have put you on a deathbed and made you rethink your priorities to put you in the right headspace, that when the right woman comes around, bang, you can take advantage of it completely. That is I mean, yeah, it's serendipity. But again, this is kind of what I opened up with. I fear of over ascribing too many things to serendipity. You must experience this yourself, right? When in case sometimes maybe it isn't. I mean, you still had total agency to make sure that, you know, you treated this woman the right way to then get her to marry you, for example. But so to try and speak about the science behind serendipity, or if possible, the math behind serendipity, you know, if it's possible. But obviously there is an author that you lean on in the book, a man called Nassim Taleb. He wrote a book called The Incerto, which is an inquisition of luck, randomness, opacity, and so forth. And he talks about, in different language, serendipity quite a lot. And there is this great sort of way of thinking about the world in the context that he puts it from the Black Swan, which is that how can we predict a future of infinite possibilities based off our finite experience of the past? You know, because we can, like we just said with Kierkegaard, you can trace it backwards, even though it's completely random. It's only understandable in hindsight, but there's an infinite set of possibilities in front of you. So the question becomes, how do I find my best path in this infinite future of possibilities? And that's where serendipity comes into it, right? Which is what your whole message through the book is: cultivate that serendipity. So I've got a lot here that I want to say about Taleb, but I just want to first ask, how has he specifically influenced your thinking? And is there other, from the scientific side of things, other authors, philosophers who have also really impacted the way you see the world, impacted your worldview?
Yeah. You know, this is super fascinating, and thank you so much for so beautifully framing it, right? Because I think that's at the core of it, right? That there's infinitive possibility out there, but like we are too narrow. Like our mind is not able to actually, you know, capture it, because by definition we can't know, but also our experience is so limited, right? And I think to me, you know, that always comes back to the kind of functional fixedness idea also, right? The hammer nail problem. If you think you can use the hammer, or the hammer is your tool, right? Then each time you want to have a nail in the wall, you're just thinking about the hammer rather than any kind of heavy object that you could just use to put that in the wall. And I think that limits us in like understanding potentiality, because we think we have our kind of path like mapped out and stuff like that. And so, you know, Taleb, in a sense, you know, I found it fascinating how he was able to bring the unexpected so prominently into the conversation. I think that was something that, you know, was much needed, and especially kind of when you think about how the world is just not, you know, as controllable as people might think it is. But I think, you know, like authors that shaped me a lot were especially Adam Grant, because he is very much into that idea of how do we, in a world that, you know, incentivizes takers and those kind of things, but actually making us happier than taking, like how do we set ourselves up for this kind of enlightened self-interest type approach? And so he's been very inspiring to me in terms of just what is the overall approach to life that can really help us to navigate this. And so I've been a big fan of these kind of psychologists slash philosophers in general, but the biggest influence definitely is the kind of Socrates type philosophers who just, you know, they were just really smart. They said, look, you got to ask why all the time. And when you start asking why all the time, when you question assumptions, that's when you see more and more potentiality happening, right? Because you go deeper and deeper to the root causes, the root dynamics, versus just seeing the surface of something that then doesn't allow us to really connect with some problem or person or else. So I think those philosophers I've always found extremely inspiring.
Okay. So no Leonard Mlodinov or similar to the scientific explanation of randomness and chance type, similar to Taleb?
You know, it's interesting because I'm a big fan of everything, you know, especially also when I grew up, like I grew up in a system that mathematics and things like that, probability, you would just learn the formula.
Definitions.
You would be kind of pushed into that.
Yeah.
And then, so, you know, I was like, oh my God. And then later on, you know, when I started studying and like, you know, more the kind of business side of things, and I was a bit more around the actual ideas behind it. Like, why is it actually useful? What can we do with this for our own life? Then I realized, wow, there's a lot of beautiful mindness in that, right? There's a lot of kind of philosophical beauty in mathematics, right? There's a lot of
100%, yeah.
Right? And so I think to that point, right, I've always felt it's almost like this kind of thing where, I feel very attracted to the kind of more philosophical, psychological types, and then I feel the mathematical in a way gives us like a nice foundation, right? So when you think about things like the birthday paradox, right, like that's a probabilistic idea that, like, in a way, in a room of 23 people, you will have a likelihood of 50% that two people have the same birthday. And you can explain that mathematically, right? Because it's an exponential function where person number 23 will have 22 people. And then if it's not the same, person 22 will have 21 people, and so on. And so it's kind of an exponential function, which, again, like when we think about the world, explains us why there's so much, to your point, infinite possibility out there, because there's just so many variables we can't know. And so long story short, I find these things super fascinating to substantiate a lot of the things that actually are about serendipity. Versus the real inspiration, I feel, comes a lot of times from the kind of, like why questioning type people out there.
I think you transitioning to the birthday paradox is perfect, because the birthday paradox can provide an allegory for how much more we have in common with each other than you would otherwise think, and therefore how much more chance there is for serendipity than you would otherwise think. And so I would ask you to please unpack the birthday paradox for us, and then for the listener, think about how next time you're in a room with 23 people, whether it's the fucking gym or a restaurant or your friend's dinner party, there is going to be some obscure stuff that you guys have in common that you can build serendipity off of. And it is explained fantastically in your book, The Birthday Paradox, which I'll ask you to unpack. And it's rooted in math. It is a principle of the universe that this is provable. So please go for it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think to your point, right, again, the base logic is, right, we assume that life is linear, like step by step. We assume, right, there's, in this example, if I would ask you, hey, what do you think is the probability of 23 people in a room, two of them having the same birthday, you would probably divide 23 and 365, right? Because that's the kind of quote unquote linear approach we're so used to, where we just look at that in that kind of unidimensional way. And then we end up with a very low probability, right? So we would assume, oh my God, it's extremely unlikely that two of us have, or that two people have the same birthday. But then obviously what happens is really to say, well, hey, it's an exponential function. As I just mentioned, you kind of in a way have all these potential, if you would draw it, right, like all these potential links, you could draw two different people. And I loved what you just did in terms of saying, how does that apply to life in general? What does that apply to life in general in terms of, if I just talk with you and I assume that you're a unidimensional person, you're the linear person, I assume. I ask you, what do? You will be in that box, right? There's not much I can connect with you. But if I ask you, what makes you come alive at the moment, just making this up, right? You could then talk about, oh my God, I got into podcasting because like my grandmother did this, but then actually this happened and this happened. And then it gives me so many potential dots where I could say, oh my God, such a coincidence. My grandmother also XYZ. Oh my God, such a coincidence. I also got inspiration from there and there. So I think what we're really talking about here is when you map the world, or not the world, but when you map potentiality as all these potential dots that are out there, if you usually only focus on more than two dots because you narrowly try to define a problem or a person, you miss out on all that potentiality that the person or the problem out there might have. And so I think if you take that into the organizational context, right, a lot of times that's it. If you just tell someone reduce costs, they will think about a lot of ways to reduce costs. If you tell them, think about how we can do better as a company, being that costs or revenues or whatever it is, they will think much bigger, right? Maybe it means increasing the price and making a better product, right? And so it's really about saying, how do you open the potential opportunity space so that more of those dots can connect?
Yeah. It's such a shame that we only have 10 minutes left, because I think there is obviously quite a lot more we could unpack in these specific areas. I wonder if you feel the same way. But there is one big question that I wanted to ask you, but I think we'll have time for it. So imagine this completely random person's profile. They're 26 years old. They don't have a professional network that is intimate by any means, but they interview a lot of people and also interviewed some genuine movers and shakers in the world. He writes a lot online. He has an extensive background in sales, and he has more ambition than he knows what to do with. So right now in 2021, what would you instruct this person to do to further expose themselves to serendipity?
Depending on what the, broader, how would you call it, sense of meaningfulness is, right? So I'm a big fan of kind of, as a first step, saying, okay, when I'll be on my deathbed in hopefully 80 years from now, right? Let's give it a lot of time. What is it that I would regret not doing? What is it that I feel pulled towards, right? What do I feel I can do in this world in some sense? And a lot of times we might not know that in advance, but it might happen over the time. So if we know that perfect, then a lot of what I'll say in a second will be very focused. If we don't know that, a lot of that will be around, okay, then let's kind of branch out a little more with the kind of strategy I'll mention in a second. But same thing, then we will rubber stamp a little bit more towards that. But ultimately, we'll probably do that as well because we've created a platform for being able to do that. So I'm a huge fan of making a list. Who are the 30 most inspirational people of who I feel that's where I want to be at some point? Of course, it's not about saying, oh, this is the one person I want to be, right? Like nobody wants to be kind of, just like in the footstep of someone. But it's really about saying, are they the kind of Adam Grants?
You draw lots of inspiration from them.
Exactly, the Taleb type people, right? Where like when you draw the inspiration from them, who are these people? How can I like make a list of this? And now how can I try to meet every single of them, every single person of them, and in some way meaningfully contribute to their life first? Is there something I can do that, if Taleb like does X, Y, Z at the moment, how can I do a podcast around this that allows me to, in a way develop something that maybe becomes meaningful for them and people around them. And at some point they say, you know what, I'm dumb that I do my own thing here. You do the thing already. I'll just come on your podcast and then we'll make it the Taleb podcast, right? These kind of things. Where it's like building incentives for others to say, hey, look, like this is kind of like what I'd love to do in that. So long story short, first thing I would do is like, who are these kind of inspiring people, how to connect with them, build a meaningful relationship with them. And that's actually where you build that kind of meaningful coincidence into it, because you're saying, if you connect with Adam Grant and you learn that they're doing X, Y, Z at the moment, and you're doing X, Y, Z at the moment, you always thought you couldn't contribute to their life, but actually you can, because they were just looking for exactly the kind of curriculum thing that you've been working on, whatever it is. So point number one, literally the kind of second degree LinkedIn, reaching out to those people and just kind of engaging them in that conversation in some way or the other. 28 won't work, but you don't need 28, right? You want to start with those two. And then you have those two people, which is time consuming. And, I feel people who have real ambition in the world know that this can be time consuming.
And to pull a 1 in 15 response is also incredibly well done, is it not? Like that also should be a caveat, don't you think? I mean, not to interrupt you, but just like, for example, I've done this exact thing. Top two was Stephen Schwartzman and Chamath Palihapitiya, men who I, admire and think what they've done is amazing, and I'd like to contribute to them somehow. But to land in their inbox is an impossible feat if you're just a random guy on the internet. So there is also, I mean, I don't want to bring any negativity to it, but I want to add a degree of realism for a person who perhaps on their list is these types. So to get 2 out of the 30, right? 1 in 15, I mean, you've done extremely well. But please, I just wanted to add that caveat. But.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, with all these things, right, the quote unquote better position you are, the easier, right? So if you have a mutual contact, if you have done something in the field, it's of course much easier, right, to get on their radar. But you know what I find fascinating? So I work a lot in contexts where people don't have any networks, where they don't have any access, right? And I talk, for example, with this Indian wonderful, who I believe will be a wonderful entrepreneur. He's like a 16-year-old kid. And that kid literally just used that approach and said, you know what? I'm reaching out to a lot of people asking if I can like do an internship with them. And 30 of them will say no, but one will say, that kid got, there's some energy here and so on. I can see myself in them when I was 50 years younger. So I'll pick that person up. My point here is that, look, these things, that's where the randomness comes in, right? That one of them sees something in you that they feel, oh, I've been there. I understand why he does that. And hey, that's why I want to connect with that person. And I think, to your point, getting on their radar, right? I'm a big fan of trying to, look, take the World Economic Forum Davos, right? Like, that's where they all hang out. It's a whole village. You don't have to be in the Congress Center. You can literally stay in a coffee shop in the village, and all these people will just walk by. They will just walk by all the time. And so what you're going to do is you look at their photos, and then whenever someone walks by, you're like, hey, great. Like, I always wanted to chat with you, whatever it is. More importantly, though, of course, you just should chat with everyone then and just let it go. My point is, this is about positioning yourself for luck by seeking out either the physical spaces also, right? Like being wherever those people hang out. If you can't get there, which I assume most people are not, then essentially saying, what is the virtual equivalent? Is there something where I can, go to that virtual conference of The Economist where one of them speaks and, they always have a couple of questions in the end. How do I make sure that I'm always the first one to ask a question? That's kind of like, to me, this is the biggest learning. In London, I used to work with kids from council flats. And those kids, they don't have any access. They come out of prison. And now, what do they do with their life? Like, they can't just send a CD. Like, nobody would react to the CD.
Sure.
But what they do is, we said, okay, go to a public event at the university, right? In this case, it was the LSE. It could be the Royal Society of Arts, whatever it is, an open space, like a university usually, right? And then listen to the speaker. And then when the speaker finishes, you are the first one with like a lot of verve to put your hand up so that they can't ignore you. And then essentially what you're going to say is, thank you so very much for this inspiring speech. As someone who just went through XYZ thing, whatever you want to share about whatever is meaningful in that context, I wanted to ask you XYZ. So you make it all about the speaker, but actually you built in that small hook where afterwards what usually happens is you have an excuse now to go to the speaker afterwards and they will be like, oh, yeah, you were the one who asked the question. But more importantly, the people in the audience, the 500 people, there's always 2 or 3 of them who will come to you and say, my God, such a coincidence. What you talked about, like my uncle actually this was at Stelios and EasyJet is currently hiring people for exactly what you're doing. I'll put you in touch. I have had people like the most amazing people in my life, both high and not so high profile, came from people randomly saying, this was an interesting question. You know what? Like a friend of mine has been thinking about this. Like I should put you in touch. So my point here is, even if we don't have access theoretically to people, we practically have it by leveraging the social capital of institutions, going to the local university when they have an inspiring speaker, being the first one asking a question, these kind of things where we can always do something. And I think out of this, usually something comes. But to your point, again, I don't think there's a golden bullet, unfortunately. Otherwise, no. Right? But I think it's a great question. And I think it's really this kind of, to your earlier great idea, right? That it is the kind of infinity out there. And so it's about us to have as many shots like as possible within the realm that we want, but also more broadly opening ourselves to what could be in the potentiality of it all.
100%. I think that this title of the podcast is A Curious Worldview. I think we share a very similar worldview in the idea that really anything is possible, especially when you consider that it is just a combination of luck and the amount of touch points you can put out into the world, the amount of serendipity you can create. Unfortunately, we have to part now, but I really appreciate you giving me the time, and I also want to congratulate you on the book as well. It's a remarkable achievement. It's as comprehensive a manual on serendipity as one could hope to find.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for linking it. I mean, for me now, it has opened up so many new kind of streams of thinking, and saying, okay, great, maybe there is more in Black Swan type things that could relate to it, or maybe there is more in, the opportunity cost ideas that could be there. So I think, thank you also for asking those really thoughtful questions and for, connecting the dots in some of those ways as well. Thank you for that.
Dankeschön.
Dankeschön.
Well, what did you think? I mean, that hour felt like 5 minutes to me, honestly. It was overwhelming. The podcast conversations always go really fast, but I mean, this one was a bit ridiculous. Something we didn't cover from the book was the copious chapters full of advice that Christian offers for one how can cultivate serendipity for themselves. At the end of the day, the more touch points you put out into the world, the more the world is going to expose you to the serendipitous opportunities. Think about it as a net of potential. The more connections you make, The more nodes of yourself and your work that you expose to the world, the wider and wider the net gets. There is so much overlap between this book and the work of Nassim Taleb. A huge part of becoming more anti-fragile and therefore defending against the black swan is explained in other language by Taleb through the notion of just maximizing serendipity. So that net, you throw it out with X amount of nodes. You can cover whatever, a little bit of territory. The older you get, the more interactions you have, the more serendipitous encounters you have in your life, the more nodes you put out into the world, the wider your net gets. And you can never guarantee that the optimal outcome is going to be within that net of potential. But the larger you make the net, the higher you make the chances as such. But to always optimize for serendipity will leave one rootless. And just realized I can't say rootless. My Australian listeners will understand. But the opportunity cost of constantly optimizing for serendipity, which means is optimizing for optionality, it comes at the cost of foundational relationships. So the best serendipitous opportunities are going to require liberty of movement and freedom of time. And these are things not possible when you have a wife and kids and you are obligated to create financial security for these people and for yourself. So this is a really important caveat to make. The kind of serendipity a young wifeless and kidless 20-year-old can expose himself to is significantly less, actually, than a 40-year-old who's lived an entire life, who's lived a life in several different countries and created a massive network for himself. He's going to have more serendipity, but he or she cannot take full advantage of these serendipitous opportunities because it will come at the cost of liberty of movement and freedom of time. They have to optimize for their foundational relationships. Whereas the young 20-year-old who doesn't have as many serendipitous opportunities, it doesn't matter because he can take any opportunity that comes his way. So that opportunity cost, that balance there, is a really important caveat to make. And so with that caveat, the overly romantic proposition of Taleb and Busch that the key to our happiness and bliss in life lies in the maximization of serendipity, it is challenged. For me, the great impact that Taleb and Busch had is the confirmation that even though the flowing movement of life is random, if you notice the chance of if you start paying attention to randomness, if you start paying attention to the potential of serendipity, you have more agency than the otherwise nihilistic response would suggest. And with that, I leave you. I want to please urge you all to go on to my website, alicegeographic.com, subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to this podcast, leave a review, all the good stuff. Write to me, get in touch. There's lots of great episodes coming out continually. So there's a Geopolitics and Power podcast and the Nassim Taleb and Certain podcast. There's lots of stuff happening. So just, you've hung around till whatever this is, hour 1, minute 65. So jump on. You're a legend. Ciao.